I'm Kimberly Atkinstor, and welcome to Justice by Design, where I break down some of the biggest issues facing us as a society and talk to the people who have the solutions about how to fix them. Don't forget to click here to like and subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts because you can find Justice by Design everywhere. You know, one of the biggest issues we are facing in this very moment is misinformation. And it can be a dangerous problem. You only have to think about the awful situation just outside of Liverpool last week when, after a terrible incident happened where little girls were stabbed at a Taylor Swift themed party, that resulted the next day in a massive anti-Islamic mob forming near a mosque, all based on information that the assailant in that awful attack was a foreign national who had come into the country seeking asylum. It turns out none of that was true. The suspect was somebody who was born in the UK, but that's just one example about how a little bit of misinformation can have enormous consequences. Here in America, we've already seen that play out. We saw it play out on January 6th. We saw it play out in a host of falsehoods that spread like wildfire across the internet after the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. And we've certainly seen a fire hose of misinformation turned on Vice President Kamala Harris since she announced her candidacy and Joe Biden dropped his bid for re-election. This is a crucial time in the fight against misinformation. Our federal officials are saying that Russia is even still at it. But instead of creating their own false news, they're trying to get Americans to do their bidding for them by spreading false lies online. I can think of nobody else better to break this down and talk about it than my friend Barb McQuade. Barb is a law professor at the University of Michigan, and she is also the author of this great book, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. I'm holding up for those who can't see, my very special signed copy of the book. Thank you for joining me, Barb.
Thanks, Kim. Glad to be with you.
So I want to start off by asking you, why focus on disinformation in this book? Why did you want to write about this?
I spent the bulk of my career as a national security prosecutor. I now teach a course at Michigan Law School on national security law. And I see this idea of information warfare as one of the biggest threats to our national security. And it's coming not just from outside our borders, from Russia and other foreign adversaries, but now we see people within our own country. That's hence the name Attack from Within, using false claims to try to mislead people or fool people. And even worse, people who know that what they're saying is a lie and are willing to go along with the con just to advance their agenda. I think it is causing deep divisions in society. I think it is leading to some of the vigilante violence that we're seeing, the threats to public officials. And I really just wanted to open people's eyes to this threat, this problem, because we need to identify a problem before we can solve it.
I think that's absolutely right. And being that we're in an election year, we're at a time where divisions are so high that the rhetoric around our politics is so divided and often violent. I think that this is just becoming a more and more important issue for us to keep our eyes on. And one thing that I really appreciated from your book is the way that you approach it. And at the beginning, you talk about the concept of being disinformed to death. Tell us a little bit about what that means. I think that so powerfully captures what's at stake here.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I start with the story of Roseanne Boyland, who maybe is not a name that is familiar to everybody, but she was one of the victims on January 6th, someone who went to the Capitol from her home in Georgia because she believed the lies she had been told about a stolen election. And she was there, in a narrow passageway on January 6th that was very crowded with people trying to press their way into the building. And she was crushed in the crowd of people. Now, she was also had ingested some substances that certainly led to her death, but it was her own sister who said, she would not have been there at all if not for all of the misinformation. So in many ways, she was disinformed to death. And I think that tragic death is a sobering analogy for what we're all facing. Democracy depends on truth and facts. We can disagree about policy matters, but we can't disagree on facts. We have to reach some consensus on what those are if we're even able to debate each other in a democracy.
Yeah, and at this moment, I think about, and one reason I really wanted to talk to you as one of the first episodes in this podcast was just how quickly disinformation can spread, and how even among the most well-meaning of people who are trying to get to the bottom of what happens, find out real information, a lot of people, a lot of sources who I know and trust, for example, in the minutes and hours after the assassination attempt against former
Mm.
President Trump, were spreading information that turned out to not be true. And I was trying to be measured and say, okay, well, whatever this is awful. This isn't what our nation should be about, but not speak to anything about what may or may not have happened until we got official word from official authorities. Yet so many things were flying around the internet about, was he shot? Wasn't he shot? Was it flying glass? Was it, did he cut him, did he cover himself catch? I mean, it was just all of this stuff, some in jest, but some really serious, suggesting that this whole thing was staged
Yeah.
just to get him attention. So talk about, in this moment, we have a political election, a very, very consequential one. And not just against about that situation, things around Vice President Kamala Harris that just aren't true, but that are getting traction and people are believing. Talk about the role of disinformation that is happening in the United States right now.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that you were calm and measured and patient is because you've been professionally trained to do that. I think journalists understand that, law enforcement understands that. But I think one of the challenges is in the effort to be correct and measured, sometimes there is a lag in time. People saw that shooting on television, but there was a delay in telling us exactly what had happened. And I think in our instant gratification society, in the absence of information, people will fill that vacuum with all kinds of things that suit their purpose. Some are deliberate in an effort to advance some agenda. Those who were saying that the shooting was staged. Others who would say this was a directive from Joe Biden to take out his political rival. Certainly none of those things were true. But other people are just hungry for information, and so they read something online and they tend to believe it. So I think that's part of what happens in our society, where everything moves so quickly. We've lost the ability to be patient and wait for all of the actual facts to come out. But I can tell you, in law enforcement, when there was some sort of incident, accident, event, so often we would get conflicting information, and you needed to be patient and sort it out until it was validated and it came from a good source before you went with it and said, we believe this fact to be true. And I think in today's fast moving society, we sometimes lose patience for that. But I also think that this effort to stoke division is something that is, I think, completely antithetical to American values in our pluralistic society. And yet there are those who will use disinformation to try to stoke division in society. So, this recent claim by Donald Trump that Kamala Harris only recently became black. She used to be Indian, and now suddenly she turned black. I think that was even what he said. She turned black. That's not true. Everybody knows that's not true, that she is in her entire life. She is a person of mixed race and has embraced both aspects of her identity, her Indian identity from her mother, her Jamaican identity from her father. Attended a historically black university at Howard University, was like the president of Black Law Students Association when she was in law school. Yep. So it's an absurd claim. But I think what the reason Donald Trump uses it is because it can be divisive in society. I suppose he hopes that people who are either Indian or black will say, oh, she's not one of us. But I think more importantly, it is a dog whistle for white people to remember that she's other, she's different, she's not one of us. And to get people talking about that. And it also came, it's a great technique of distraction. He was
Yes.
asked some hard questions, and instead of answering the hard questions, he comes back with something that's sort of outrageous, and then that's what everybody is talking about. So, it's a technique. I talk about this in the book. You may recall the part where Jair Bolsonaro in
Hmm.
Brazil was asked a question about corruption in his administration, and he tells the reporter, "You have a terribly homosexual face." Now, what kind of thing to say is
Oh
that,
my
right? So, of
gosh.
course, the public goes crazy over this absurd statement, and
Right.
nobody's talking about the corruption anymore. So,
Right.
it's a tactic, it's a strategy. And, I hope that, by now we're catching on to some of the tricks. But, we'll talk about solutions in a minute. But that's the goal that is being pushed when people engage in these kinds of tactics.
That is so important because I think sometimes, I know I do, speaking for myself, when I think about disinformation, I think about, Russia injecting,
Hmm.
making false Facebook pages, directed
Yeah,
at Black
sure.
people during, 26, like doing these sort of things. But disinformation can just be the things that people say, right?
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and looking over your book again, I came across a quote actually on social media that I'd seen before, but it's so perfect for this conversation. It's from Hannah Arendt, who says,
Mm,
"If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer.
yeah.
And people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such people, you can do what you please." And so that is such a crucial tool for
Yeah.
anybody in power who is seeking to make things opaque, muddy the waters, kick up sand, I won't use the phrase that Steve Bannon used, but basically do
Yeah.
that. Just
Yeah.
flood the zone with so much junk
Yeah.
that people just give up. Like they don't even try to figure out what happens, and they just sort of follow the pack. And I think that's what so many people want to do. And it's effective. It's effective. You're absolutely right. People talked about Donald Trump being racist, which is not a new headline, but they
Right.
didn't talk about the fact that he was not being accountable to anything.
Yeah. He wasn't answering the questions
No.
that he was specifically asked about his administration and his policies and other kinds of things. It reminds me of the time when he was asked about, there were allegations about Jared Kushner and his security clearance.
Hmm.
And that's when he talked about, people living in, and I'll quote him, not my, I'm not one for cursing, Kim, as you well know, but he talked
You?
about, people who lived in shithole cities.
Yeah.
And again, he distracted the conversation away from these allegations to this outrageous thing that he had said. And so
Hmm.
it's a game, and it's a tactic. And if we can see through it, then we are less likely to be manipulated by it.
So this podcast is about solutions, and that's why I want you to be here because um, the in your book you lay out solutions for of solutions for a lot of people, right? You have
Hmm.
solutions for government, solutions for law enforcement, solutions for people like you and me,
Hmm.
to keep from being disinformed and to help fight this kind of disinformation. So first, let's talk about the law,
Hmm.
Professor McQuade. Are the laws in place sufficient to really battle the kind of disinformation that we are seeing, not just domestically, the things we've been talking about?
Hmm.
There's also a report recently from federal law enforcement that Russia's still at it,
Oh,
but they're
yeah.
trying to get Americans to spread this information among each other in our conversations and on social media, as opposed to doing like they did in 2016 and making these false
Hmm.
sites. They're just trying to drop information into the ears of Americans so that they will spread it. They're doing it in a different way. So are the laws sufficient to stop that and other kinds of disinformation we're
Um,
talking about?
I think they're not.
Hmm.
We have the Telecommunications Decency Act of 1996, enacted at a time when social media was not really a thing in its infancy. And if you read that section, it reads almost like a children's novel in its awe of the internet. It will be a wonderful thing to connect people with ideas all over the world, which it is, right? I mean,
It
we
is.
can connect. You and I are connecting now from many miles away.
I can hear the
Um,
sound of the dial-up modem from, our
yeah,
AOL days. Like I hear that
exactly.
as you
With
say
that
that.
beep, that awful beep sound. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, but that made sense then, right? Because
Right.
Congress was eager to foster innovation and investment in this new technology of social media, internet service providers. Well, here we are almost 30 years later, and the world has changed. And we have seen some of the collateral consequences of giving immunity to all of these internet service providers. Now, I'm not saying that it needs to be completely eradicated. I'm not saying we should monitor content because that runs afoul of the First Amendment and starts getting tricky there. Um, but I think some of the things we could do is to say, social media companies, you are responsible, not for the content on your sites because you're just providing the platform, but for the things you produce. So, what are some of the things that you're engaged in? What's your conduct? And some of those things are the algorithms that they use. So it's the social media companies themselves that create the algorithms that tell our accounts what to lift up and to show to us.
Mhm.
And we know from the whistleblower who testified before Congress, former Facebook data scientist Frances Haugens, we know that what she said is it's not the content, it's the algorithms. That's
Mm.
where the action is, that's where the money is. Because what Facebook realized is if they can increase engagement, that is how much time you spend on the platform and you're liking and sharing and sending content, uh, that was worth a lot to advertisers, because if you're on there longer, you're going to see more of their ads, and so they could charge more money and sell more ads. So outrage equaled content, because the more outraged we were, the more likely we were to stay online. And so Facebook was, uh, you know, uh, calibrating the algorithm to maximize outrage.
Mm.
And so, no wonder we're all angry with each other. All we
Right.
see is all of this stuff that is deliberately stoking division in society. So why couldn't we say, look, social media companies, you are immune from liability for the content on your platforms, but for the algorithms you create, if you are creating algorithms with the purpose, you've designed it for the purpose of generating outrage, that's not permitted, and you are subject to fine or loss of licensure or disbarment or
Yeah.
criminal or whatever you want to make it. I think similarly, we could put other requirements on social media companies that would be, part of this catch of, if you want your immunity, that's fine, but stop scraping our personal data and selling
Mhm.
it to data brokers, who in turn sell it to political operatives and to commercial enterprises. When you go online and you see all the ads that are there, they'll ask me something like, "Would you like to buy a Detroit Tigers cap?"
Yeah.
Why, I most certainly would. How did you know? They know more about us than we know about ourselves,
It's
because they
frightening.
are scraping all of our likes and shares and what we post and what we read, what we send around, and they build these portfolios on us, so they're able to micro target content designed specifically for us. There was that group called Cambridge Analytica. It was a research group that Steve Bannon founded during the 2016 election, and they were collecting data on people and building voter profiles. So they knew who were likely voters, who could take a nudge, who would be likely to repeat some awful content,
Mm.
and really manipulating people in this way. So, again, I think that rather than a boilerplate, you're in or you're out on privacy, some meaningful privacy reforms. And, there's some hope on this. There's the Kids Online Safety Act was just passed by the Senate,
Mhm.
not yet the House, that does do this with regard to children.
Yep.
And so that I'll take it. That's a start, right? If we can solve it with children, then perhaps the next step is for everybody.
Right.
I think we could tell social media platforms, if you want your immunity, you got to get rid of all the bots. They have the ability, the technical capacity to detect the bots. And the bots, of course, are these AI generated accounts that look like real people, but they are there to like and share false content or to pick arguments with people based on computer programs. Like if they see the word favoring gun control. They are coming after you, and they're going to call you every name in the book. You racist, radical,
Yeah.
leftist, whatever it is. And if you argue back, you may not realizing it, but you're only arguing with software. So that's something else that really amps up the outrage online. And finally, with regard to some of the laws pertaining to social media, the requirement to disclose who is behind paid advertising for politics. On the radio or TV ads, you'll hear the candidate say, I'm Donald Trump and I approve this ad. No such thing on the interwebs because there's no FCC licensing requirement there. And so
Right.
it could be, who knows, it could be Russia. It could be the gun lobby who's putting something up in favor of Donald Trump or in favor of Kamala Harris. We should know who's paying for those ads
Mhm.
so that, even if we can't limit the amount of money being spent on them, we at least have some visibility into who is behind it.
Yeah, and that's such an important part. I mean, it's not always a perfect analogy when we're talking about online communications, but when you're thinking about the information marketplace, right, with the whole basis of the First Amendment protection of free speech, and that you allow people to give speech because the best way to counteract bad speech is with good speech. But if you don't know who's making it, what
Right.
it's coming from, then that marketplace doesn't work. It's not a free market, so to speak. It's a
Yeah.
market with the thumb on the scale toward disinformation. So you need these kind of really, I mean, it seems commonsensical, but you really do need these levers in place to balance that out, to make sure that people, the information that they're getting, they may not agree with it, but at least it's good information. It's not bad information. The same way that you wouldn't allow dangerous products to be put in the
Right.
marketplace, you shouldn't
Exactly.
allow dangerous, fact-free information that can have real
Yeah.
consequences. I mean, we saw from January 6th the consequences of disinformation. We saw, in England with this mob of people chanting anti-Islam things and attacking a mosque because they thought that an asylum seeker, a foreign asylum seeker, attacked little girls when it was just flat out wrong, that the
Yeah.
person who carried out a terrible attack at a party was not even a foreign national. Like
Yeah.
that, it can have such awful consequences. So what you were talking about too dives into where I wanted to go, which is, a lot of time people ask us, whether it's on hashtag sisters or in law or elsewhere, what can we do? Like what can we do? But part of it is telling your lawmakers to
Yeah.
support and get behind the sort of common sense legislation that you're talking about. But talk a little more about what people can do when it comes to disinformation to protect themselves, as well as calling for their leaders to to do better to protect us from this.
Yeah. And by the way, when you are reaching out to your lawmaker, your member of Congress, right now there's the Kids Online Safety Act passed by the Senate.
Yep.
Great time to be advocating with your member of Congress. Sending an email to your member of Congress is a great way to get to them. Um, Phone calls are fine, but it relies on somebody to, write down the message. In an email, they can also track how many people care about an issue. This was, I read a really interesting article about when Republicans came to power in the House and the initial goal was to repeal Obamacare. They got so many emails from people
Mm.
saying, don't take my Obamacare, that they backed down on it because they realized they were getting hundreds of these emails and they could count them and they could read them
Wow.
and they could see what people thought. And so it really changed the tone of, because they became aware of what their constituents thought. So email your member of Congress. And what can ordinary people do to protect themselves from disinformation, as you just asked? An excellent question. Well, there are a number of things. And I will tell you, Kim, there was a time, I cite an example in the book, a time I myself, believe it or not, was actually fooled by some misinformation. I saw something online that said that Patrick Mahomes, the NFL quarterback,
Yeah.
had made a statement that he would refuse to play another down with the Kansas City Chiefs until they changed their name to something that was not objectionable and offensive to Native Americans. And
Mm.
why did I get this? Well, I'm a big sports fan.
Yep.
It's an issue I care about. I think it is offensive to use Native American names as nicknames and mascots for professional and college sports teams. So, the micro targeting had my name all over it, and I got it. And I saw this thing, and rather than do all the good things I'm about to describe, I quickly retweeted it, sent that around. And only later that day did I learn that it was a fake and took it down. And I noticed that it didn't come from, it was on Twitter. It was not ESPN's Sports Center, but it looked pretty good. ESPN, but it said Sprott Center. Not a real thing. Sprott Center. Didn't read the fine print. So it was a fake, and I fell for it. And those are the kinds of things just designed to stoke division. To say, who are you to be so woke and all tradition and all these sorts of things. But so there's some things we can do. So when you see something like that, a claim, and you think, wow, I wonder if this is true. There are a number of things that we can do to check. Number one, if this is a genuine story, it's going to be reported in multiple places, right? It's not going to be just on ESPN Sprott Center. It's going to be in the New York Times, in the Athletic, in your local paper, AP News. It's going to be all over the place. So you can search to see if a claim like this is true before you send it along. It's also very important to check the credibility of the source. If I had read a little more carefully and noticed that it was Sprott Center and not Sports Center, I may have refrained from sending it along. But, genuine news sites with credibility of a news brand, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the New York Times, they are professional organizations that are going to vet their news sources. They are going to require attribution. They're going to have multiple layers of editors before they send something out. That is a credible news source. Instead of Patriot Girl, and sometimes those are the things we see online who are sending these things out. An individual we don't even know. And those are often the people who are Russian operatives posing as Americans or other haters. If you look at your feed and you see that the hateful rhetoric, it's almost always from somebody with some nickname like, Eagle Man. It's always something, a faux patriotic kind of thing. Another tip, Kim, and I know we've joked about this because sometimes the article has been something you yourself wrote in the Boston Globe, to read the article before you send just the headline. Sometimes they'll give you a prompt, like, don't you want to read the article before you send it on?
Like, I wrote this. I'm trying to post
I know what it says. But it's it's a really good practice because the headlines so rarely match the article these days. I was on a tour of a Detroit newspaper with a reporter once a few years ago, and she showed me this big board they had in their newsroom that ranked the stories based on clicks that they were getting. And it was really sad because the top stories were stories about the weather, celebrities, pets, and all at the bottom, barely scratching the surface were things like, the state budget and, things that like matter that people should be paying attention to. So the headlines are often clickbait. I just saw one the other day. This is a great example. The headline was Caitlin Clark, who she is, the basketball player, went to Iowa, now is in the WNBA. Caitlin Clark media meltdown. Now, to read that, I clicked on it. Like, oh my gosh, it must have finally gotten to her. She's been so calm and cool and professional. She must have finally wigged out and said something awful. No, you would be wrong because that's not what happened at all. It was that she was at a press conference and some media member called her a profane-laden name. She didn't, have a meltdown. A reporter did. But the headline was Caitlin Clark media meltdown. So if you believe, if you just read that, you'd believe something else. So those are some important tips. When you're reading the article, look for evidence and attribution, not just that the author says it so. What is the evidence they use to cite this thing? So I think those are some of the, the top 5 ideas about how you can protect yourself from falling for a false claim. But the last one I'll add is this: even if you read something and you believe it to be true, don't take the bait, because so much of this stuff is put out there just to get a response, to rile people up so that they say, no, I'm not, you are, the kind of stuff that, Donald Trump is famous for, just, I'm not a puppet, you're the puppet.
Right.
And it doesn't add to the discourse. And that's the goal, is to stoke division in society so that people are either, us versus them, one side or the other. And in fact, to get anything done in this country, we have to come together in unity. But there are some who follow this what's known in debate as the either or fallacy, which is there are only two sides to every issue, and if you're not with me, you're against me. And so I think if we can refrain from taking the bait, we can tamp down some of those efforts to divide us.
So I appreciate all of that, and I think that is all really, really good advice. I will add, even as you're, clicking the link and reading the story, always consume your news very thoughtfully. Be an
Mm-hmm.
intelligent and active consumer
Yep.
of news because it can mislead too. I mean, I get very upset with misleading stories, even that aren't inaccurate. There was one just today that came out of the New York Times. Sorry, me pumpernickel. There was one that I saw recently that came out of the New York Times. Again, it was about Kamala Harris, and it was about how Republicans are attacking her, saying that she's from Canada, and that was the headline. I'm like, all right, let me read the story, and because certainly in the first graph, it says that she's from Oakland.
Yeah.
And no, it goes through and it talks about these Republicans saying that she's from Vancouver. First of all, she never lived in Vancouver. She, as a teenager, for a short period of time, her mother was a researcher at a university in Montreal, and so she lived there for a little while. But
They don't
she
even
lived
know
there,
which end of Canada is
right?
which.
It's
Yeah.
like it was like 12 or she was like 12 or 13 by this point. She
Yeah.
was born and raised in Oakland, but it didn't say that. And I'm like,
Mm.
oh, come on, right?
Yeah.
This is not helping. So
Yeah. Yeah.
consume that news. But I want to finally leave you with something, hopefully a little lighter, just not only to give the hope of the solutions that you laid out, but also keep it a little fun, because this is a heavy topic. What is your take on memes? See, I got by a meme that was
Mm.
meant to be fun. It was
Yeah.
about Kamala Harris, and I was just scrolling through, the interwebs, and I came across this post on Threads which showed her holding a picture of an album, and I was like, I did not know that Kamala Harris was into Deep Purple. And then I found out, I was almost gonna like retweet that and say I
Yeah.
didn't know. I'm just learning new things about her every day. And it was a meme generator that
Mm.
you could put whatever album cover you want of her. I'm sure
Yeah.
I'm sure our listeners have heard this. And I was kind of mad, 'cause I'm like, you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
what? Somebody could put like
Yeah.
some, devil worshiping album or something.
Yes.
I'm
And people
so
will believe it.
nervous. Right. The
Yeah.
fact that it got me, like for a minute, I was believing what I was seeing with my own lion eyes.
Yeah.
Um,
I
how do
hate
you
to
feel
be a
about that?
buzzkill and ruin all the fun, but would it be so bad to label it?
Yeah,
I mean, so go ahead and have your
clearly.
funny little memes,
Yep.
like, ha ha, give us a little
Yep.
chuckle, because I think there's room for satire.
Yeah.
That's important. To be able to tweak our leaders, I think, is a way of, um, exercising power against them when we are less powerful people. But I think to the extent you're altering a photo that people might rely on, that one's harmless. But imagine something else. There are all these deep nudes going around now where they put
Yeah.
someone's face on someone else's body and
Yep.
things that can be really harmful or really defamatory. So I think I'd be in favor of, I know it kind of spoils the gag a little bit, but a label that just says, this image was generated with a meme generator or AI or whatever it is.
And
That's my solution.
there is some legislation that is aimed at, things you were talking about, the deep fakes and other things, that
Hmm.
just said you have to put on
Yeah.
there if this was created by anything other
Yeah.
than the actual image. You just have to say so, which is
Yeah.
again goes back to the information that we
Exactly.
get.
Marketplace, right?
Disclose it. The marketplace, it just has to be good information if you
Hmm.
disclose that. So I'm with you. Let's have
All right.
fun, but let's be really clear that it's fun. Because in this day and age, you never know. You never know, and the consequences could be terrible. So, Barb McQuade, thank you so much, my sister, for joining me on this to talk about this really, really important thing. And our listeners can find you on social media. They can find you on hashtag Sisters in Law with Us, which drops every Saturday, and they can definitely pick up your book called Attack from Within. Thank you, Barb.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be on Justice by Design. Congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you. Okay, so we can still have fun. We can still use our memes. Who would I have done for the album meme generator for Kamala Harris? Probably Funkadelic or Parliament. I think that she would dig that. That would be good. But yeah, more information is better there. It's better for us to know what we're talking about. It's better for us to be careful. I think one thing I understand is the need for people to respond quickly. You want to, on the day that gunfire broke out at that Trump rally, I wanted to be able to say something comforting to the nation, to say we are better than this as a nation, and this isn't that our political discourse should not descend into violence. But I tried my best to wait, to take a beat, to not respond immediately, to not demand immediate information, because sometimes the best information just takes a little bit of time. And making sure you have the information that you need and you're not accidentally doing the bidding of those who want to see the zone flooded with all kinds of nonsense takes a minute. It takes practice. It takes patience. But it's something that we all need to have if we're going to have the kind of democracy that we want. So I thank Barb for helping us break that down. And I thank you for joining me on Justice by Design. Don't forget to follow us anywhere you get your podcasts. Don't forget to give 5 stars, because that lets other people find this show as we get off the ground. And remember that justice doesn't happen on its own. It has to be done by design. See you next time.